Welcome back to Davos Energy Week. I'm excited to welcome our next guest speaker, Tina Bru, the Norwegian Minister of Petroleum and Energy, the country which already has one of the most decarbonized power generation systems in the world and one of the largest oil and gas exporters at the same time. Minister Bru, welcome to Davos Energy Week.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Your country has a unique combination of energy resources. Norway is one of the world's biggest oil and gas producer, and at the same time, your country's electricity is mostly produced from hydropower. However, there are other CO2 emission sources like oil refineries, heavy transport, or home heating, which your government is planning to reduce. In February 2020, your country announced its enhanced emission reduction goals of at least 50% by 2030. As we are about 1 year behind that announcement, can you say now that this goal implementation is on track?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for the opportunity to elaborate a little bit on how Norway is reaching its goals and what our long-term plans are. As you, of course, mentioned yourself, Norway has, of course, an abundant supply of energy and natural resources. 98% of our electricity production is renewable. We have, of course, abundant oil and gas resources. Our wind resources are excellent, and we still have also remaining oil and gas resources that are still considerable, and half actually remains to be produced. So we, of course, alongside this, also have very ambitious targets for both our 2020 climate goals and also our 2030 climate goals. And we are good and well on track to reaching our goals for 2020. We have considerably lower emissions now than we did in 1990. And of course, they have been extra low this year, of course, due to the pandemic, but still we are on track. And we have not yet received the figures for 2020, but I'm pretty sure that we will be reaching our targets. So now we are also looking forward to 2030, and we have, as you mentioned, also a very ambitious target here. And the government actually just recently came forward with a white paper that is a climate plan on how we are to reach our 2030 target. And that will be, of course, it will be complicated. It will demand a lot of all of us, not only politicians, but also businesses and everyday normal people that are living their lives, because this is not going to be easy, but we are firmly committed. And we have, in relation to that, of course, implemented several different things that are bringing us in that direction, using, amongst other things, of course, a carbon tax on emissions, both in the ETS sector and also in the sectors that are not part of the ETS sector. But we are also cooperating closely with the EU on this, and our climate policy is very well linked to the EU. So we are ambitious, but we are also very optimistic and positive that this will bring us to where we need to be. And it's not only about cutting emissions here in Norway, it's also about creating green growth, new jobs, and value creation. So we're looking at it as a win-win situation.
Thank you. So from long-term goals, let's talk about short-term implementation plans. So what is your country's action plan for the next 2 years? What are the major milestone projects that we are going to hear about from you in the next few months?
Well, the most important one is, of course, the white paper that I just mentioned, which kind of is the plan and the roadmap to reaching the 2030 targets that will have a huge importance for how our country is actually transformed toward 2030. But in addition to this, I'm also going to present a separate white paper this spring that focuses on the long-term value creation from energy resources in Norway, because it is key to our being able to create more jobs, to do so in a sustainable way and build on our resources. So this plan will talk about several different things. One of the big things that will be a part of it is also a separate plan on how we're going to also reduce emissions from our oil and gas production by 50% by 2030, an ambitious goal, but also possible. Also, we are looking at how to handle an increased electrification of society, because one of the one of the biggest ways in reducing emissions is, of course, by using more clean electricity over other sources of energy to reduce emissions. And then, of course, there is CCS and the Norwegian Longship project, which I think we will be able to discuss more later. But this is, of course, also a huge project that is really important in the next years here in Norway and towards 2030. The white paper will also be looking at offshore wind. We have great potential for that as well here in Norway. We actually recently just opened 2 areas for concessions here on offshore wind, both floating wind and also wind that is attached to the seabed. So this is also an opportunity to create more jobs. We have long and proud traditions in the maritime industry. We have key competence from the oil and gas sector that can also be deployed in this sector. So we are really also going to be looking at that. In addition, we're also looking at deep sea mining, which is also something that we know we are going to need in the renewable future as well. We are increasingly dependent on minerals that we need in all types of things that we do. And this is also something that we're looking at the possibility of doing in Norway from our continental shelf. And last but not least, we will also be talking about hydrogen in this white paper, because that is also another level, another thing that we can see the potential for here in Norway, not only because we have huge natural gas resources that can be created for hydrogen using CCS, which will remove the emissions from that hydrogen. And also we have abundant renewable power, which also makes it possible to produce renewable or so-called green hydrogen. So we're creating a roadmap for that to follow up on the strategy for hydrogen that we actually presented just last year.
Thank you. I just heard that your plan for oil and gas industry is to reduce the production by 50% by 2030. That's been your long-term goal. At the same time, in the last few years, we see your country has been very active in awarding new exploration licenses and supporting the upstream oil industry. So what is your long-term goals? This is something that we already know. And what is your short-term action plan for 2021 and 2022? What are you going to do?
Well, just first to say that our long-term goal is not to reduce production by 50%. It's to reduce emissions by 50%. Our long-term goal for Norwegian oil and gas sector is to maintain a stable production at levels that we're seeing now. That will, of course, depend on whether we find more, what kinds of investments, what kinds of projects that are driven forth on the continental shelf. But our policy is aimed at maintaining the level of production that we're on right now, but at the same time reducing the emissions, which is going to be key. And a big part of that is, of course, using also for our offshore installations more power from shore, electrification to bring down the emissions. So in the longer term, also yet to find resources will be important. So we are maintaining our policy at making areas available for exploration on the Norwegian continental shelf. But of course, we have to find something to produce it. So it's still we're not able to say at this time what our production levels will be looking like in the future. But our aim is to maintain it at a stable level. And of course, this last year has been very trying also for the Norwegian oil and gas sector. Due to the pandemic, of course, where we saw a huge drop in demand for oil and gas. So what we did in the short term here in Norway is that we've actually made some adjustments to our tax regime to sustain the level of activity on the Norwegian continental shelf, to make sure that profitable production and profitable investment plans are actually going ahead. Because we did see a sharp drop in this, and we saw almost all kinds of activity just being slowed down or stopped because of the pandemic. And our long-term goal is, of course, to produce all profitable resources from Norwegian oil and gas production. So to maintain that and to not lose key competence, not to lose projects that we know are profitable, good projects because of this very extraordinary situation that we are seeing with the pandemic, we proposed for Parliament a temporary adjustment in the tax regime, and I'm very glad that the Norwegian Parliament also said they agreed to that. So that is in place right now, and we're seeing also good effects from it, and that will be this plan will be in action for a few years until we can come back to the normal levels that we were at before the pandemic. So just another point that I would like to mention that we're doing that has to do both with the long-term production levels and how we're going to reach our goals also for this sector. We have said that we are going to increase the carbon price for the oil and gas sector. So that means that when today they pay a carbon tax and an ETS tax altogether amounting to around 800 Norwegian crowns. But when we come to 2030, that price is going to be 2,000 Norwegian crowns. And I think this gives a much needed predictability for this sector as to what kind of climate framework they also have to abide by and what they are looking at for the future to make smart decisions and invest in good also climate technology to bring emissions further down. We know this is a kind of policy that works. We have had a carbon tax on Norwegian oil and gas productions since 1990. So this is something that works, and we're using this same kind of tool to push even further in a right directions to cut emissions. So in the longer term, our petroleum production is going to, and our policy is going to aim at maintaining a stable and predictable framework. That is the most key thing for also the oil and gas companies to invest on the Norwegian continental shelf. So we have to also to continue to provide interesting and attractive exploration acreage, which we are also doing. And of course, keeping up the focus on research and development, because we know it's through research and development you find the new solutions and you find also the technology that can help bring down emissions and also produce in a more cost-effective way, giving more value creation.
Thank you very much. My next question will be about the natural gas. Many countries bet on natural gas as a pillar of their energy transition strategies. So what will be the role of natural gas for the energy transition in Norway?
Well, we're seeing that I think natural gas is going to be playing a key role for many years to come, not least because many European countries also depend on it increasingly to cut their own emissions. We are seeing also that a lot of countries have actually been able to cut their emissions from switching from coal to gas. So in a long term, I think we are going to see natural gas playing a role just on that. But at the same time, I also see a role for natural gas when it comes to hydrogen, as I shortly mentioned earlier. Because when we're seeing the big plans that a lot of countries now have on the deployment of hydrogen in many different sectors, the volume is enormous. We're going to need a huge amount to be able to actually get to those hard to abate sectors and to reduce emissions and moving away from fossil fuels. And I don't think, or in my opinion, hydrogen purely from renewable energy resources won't be enough. I think we're going to need also hydrogen produced from natural gas. But then it's very important for me to stress that we need the hydrogen that is also clean from natural gas. You need to have it in play on team with CCS. So you need to actually find a way to clean up the natural gas, make it clean, and then use it as hydrogen. And we have taken a huge step also here in Norway recently on making this a possibility, because we have just said that we are going to invest in Longship, which is the biggest climate project in Norwegian industry ever. And just shortly to explain what it's about, it's a carbon capture plan for a cement factory here in Norway, and possibly also a waste to energy plant after a while, to capture the CO2 from this cement plant and then ship it and store it on the Norwegian continental shelf in the Northern Lights project. And the Northern Lights project, the storage has more capacity to add on CO2 emissions for storage from other places in the world. So I think this is also something that we can use if we also want to deploy hydrogen from natural gas on a big scale, because it has to be clean. There really isn't a room for emissions from energy sources when we're getting to 2030 and thinking up to 2050. So we have to plan for energy that is clean. But I think gas also here can play a role when it comes to hydrogen.
Thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit about transport and fuels. Transport, as in many countries of the world, has been one of the main sources of emission. And at the same time, we see a sharp rise in electric vehicle sales in Norway in the last 2 years, which is projected to grow further. By 2025, you are planning to ban sales of new petrol and diesel cars, as well as light vans, one of the first countries in the world to do that. With all these measures, in addition to your favorable tax policy, what is your estimate on emission reduction from transport in the coming years?
Well, we know the transport sector is key to reaching our 2030 goals. So our climate plan that we just announced actually also talks a lot about the transportation sector, of course. But first, let me just also clear up. Norway is not going in for a ban on fossil fuel cars in 2025. What our goal is, and our vision and the target that we have set, is that all new vehicles that are sold by 2025, both personal vehicles and also some low heavy duty trucks, will be zero emissions, but it's not a ban. And we're seeing that the policies that we've had in place for several years are really bringing us to meet that target. 50% of all new sales in Norway last year were electric vehicles. So we are on track, and I really do think we're going to reach this ambition, but not by ban, just by actually incentive policies that make it easier to choose a vehicle that has lower emissions. And that has been key to this policy all along. It's not about finding ways to punish those who choose to use a vehicle that is a fossil vehicle, but it's to make it more attractive to use a vehicle that is low emissions. And that's also why we're seeing this huge boom in the EV market here in Norway. And I think, if I don't remember incorrectly, in December, almost 70% of sales in the car market here in Norway were electric vehicles. So we are really on track, and I really think we're going to reach this. But it's a combination of good policy. It's a commitment. We've had this in place for many years. And many people, I often say that this is probably one of the biggest paradoxes, that we in Norway are so keen on pushing policy to increase electric vehicle sales, because as a big oil and gas producing country, we are effectively actually helping to undermine one of the most important markets for our most important products. But we still know, when everything comes down to it, we know that we actually have to succeed at this if we are going to be able to reach the targets that we have set for ourselves globally, in order to not see irreversible climate change that will have catastrophic consequences for the world. So we have to get there, and I think we have to be able to think two things at once, and you have to have good policies that push, and you have to have stamina and ambition, and then you will eventually reach the goals. And I think the Norwegian example is an example of that.
Thank you. I'm sure you will. My final question to you will be about innovation. There are a lot of technology providers watching us right now, and I know that your government's priorities is in financing innovation and research. So how our business participants, as well as technology providers in energy industry from around the world, including promising energy startups, can get a chance to compete for the public investments into this field that you make?
Yeah, well, for Norway, it's always been key that the competition on research here is on the basis of quality and relevance. And that, I think, ensures that the best possible projects also are granted financial support. And that needs to be kind of key and base in this kind of policy. But we are really looking to also amp up our efforts when it comes to research. We know this is so important to also help drive the technology shifts, and we're seeing a lot of interesting projects in the energy sector. And we here in Norway, we coordinate and research our research efforts, and we prioritize areas where Norway has a competitive advantage. So to this end, businesses that are interested in this industry and the research community around this, I think, have good opportunities in Norway to also work on research. So we give advice on national research strategies for both the petroleum and the energy sector. And these kinds of strategies, they have guidelines for different programs that we have here in Norway by the Research Council of Norway. And they are revised quite often. in order to keep up with the really fast development that we're seeing in this sector and on energy research. So I think it's also important to say that we are closely working also with the EU. We are committed to the Horizon 2020 program in the EU, which of course is key. And we see also a lot of Norwegian businesses actually competing very well there and joining in European research efforts. And I think that is key also, that we have international cooperation on this, that it's not every country for itself, but that we work together in finding solutions and to also pool our resources so that we can get the most out of the resources that we use on research and development. But we're not, again, going to be able to reach our energy goals for the world or our climate goals for the world if we don't have a focus on research. So that is very important for the future.
Minister, thank you very much for your elaborate answers to our questions. Thank you very much for your contribution to Davos Energy Week. I wish you all the best in advancing Norway's energy transition projects, and hope to see you in Davos next year.
Thank you.